The thermometer nailed to the outside wall read 43 degrees below zero, but inside the Ravine cabin, Cyrus Haldane sat in his shirt sleeves watching frost patterns form on the window while his fire burned low. Every trapper within 20 miles was burning through a week's worth of wood each day just to stay alive. But Cyrus had used only 3 logs since the blizzard started 2 days ago. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The wind cut through the Montana wilderness with a fury that made breathing painful. Cyrus Haldane pulled his wool scarf tighter across his face and checked the trap line one more time. His partner, Lazarus Gorman, trudged 20 yards behind, moving slower than usual. They had been checking beaver traps along the frozen creek since dawn, and the temperature had dropped steadily all morning. By midday, Cyrus estimated it was 15 degrees below zero, maybe colder with the wind. Lazarus stumbled. Cyrus turned and saw his partner's face had gone pale beneath his beard. The older man's movements were stiff, mechanical. His hands, even in heavy mittens, weren't working properly. Cyrus recognized the signs immediately. Frostbite was setting in, and they were still 3 miles from their cabin. They abandoned the remaining traps and started back. The wind pushed against them as they climbed out of the creek bottom toward the exposed ridge where their cabin stood. Standard frontier wisdom said to build high, with clear sight lines. Their cabin followed that wisdom perfectly. It sat on a windswept hillside with visibility in all directions. Good for spotting threats, terrible for everything else. By the time they reached the cabin, Lazarus could barely walk. Cyrus got him inside and immediately built up the fire. Their cabin was typical of the era. Logs notched at corners, chinked with moss and mud, a single room with 1 door and 1 small window. The fire roared in the stone hearth, consuming wood at an alarming rate, but the heat seemed to vanish into the walls and roof. Cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking. Wind penetrated every crack and crevice. The cabin was better than being outside, but not by much. Cyrus wrapped Lazarus in every blanket they owned and kept the fire burning. He fed logs into the flames every 20 minutes. The interior thermometer hanging on the wall showed 18 degrees. With a fire consuming enough wood to last a week under normal circumstances, the cabin could barely maintain a temperature above freezing. Through the night, Cyrus fought to keep the fire going. He burned their spare chair. He burned fence posts he had cut for spring projects. Nothing made a difference. The cold was winning. Lazarus stopped shivering around midnight. By dawn, he was dead. Cyrus sat beside his partner's body as gray light filled the cabin. The fire had finally gone out. He had burned everything burnable. The thermometer read 9 degrees. A man had frozen to death inside a cabin with a roaring fire burning all night. That reality settled into Cyrus's mind with absolute clarity. The cabin had failed. Standard frontier construction had killed his partner as surely as if the walls had collapsed. He buried Lazarus that afternoon in ground frozen solid. It took 4 hours to dig a shallow grave using a pickaxe to break through the frost layer. He marked it with stones and returned to the empty cabin. That night, unable to sleep, Cyrus began thinking about what had gone wrong and how to ensure it never happened again. Cyrus spent the next 3 weeks finishing the trapline season alone. Every day he checked traps, processed pelts, and maintained the failing cabin. Every night he thought about Lazarus dying while fire burned uselessly beside him. The question became an obsession. Why couldn't the cabin hold heat? He started paying attention to temperature in ways he never had before. He noticed the root cellar they had dug for storing vegetables stayed warmer than the cabin, even without fire. He descended into it one evening with his thermometer and watched the mercury settle at 42 degrees. Outside, the air was 5 below zero. The root cellar, surrounded by earth on all sides, maintained a temperature 47 degrees warmer without any heat source. The observation stuck with him. Earth held heat, or more accurately, Earth maintained stable temperature regardless of what happened on the surface. He remembered stories from his childhood in Vermont about spring houses built partially underground, staying cool in summer and warm in winter. He recalled visiting a cousin who worked in a coal mine and feeling the strange warmth once you descended below the frost line. Cyrus began visiting other locations during his daily travels. He found an abandoned prospect hole some miner had started years earlier. The shaft went down 12 feet before the miner had apparently given up. Cyrus climbed down with his thermometer. At the bottom, sheltered from wind and surrounded by earth, the temperature held steady at 48 degrees. Above ground, it was 12 below zero. He started watching animals. Rabbits dug burrows deep into snowbanks. Bears denned in caves or hollow trees surrounded by earth and stone. Wolves sought shelter in ravines and rock formations during the worst weather. No animal built its winter shelter on an exposed hilltop. They all sought earth contact, wind protection, and thermal mass. One afternoon, checking traps near a deep ravine he usually avoided, Cyrus noticed the snow patterns. On the exposed slopes, wind had scoured the snow down to bare ground in places and piled it into deep drifts in others. Inside the ravine, snow lay in even layers, undisturbed by wind. The massive rock walls blocked air movement completely. He descended into the ravine, curious. The temperature difference was immediate and striking. Outside the ravine, wind drove the cold through his layers of clothing. Inside the ravine, the air was still. His thermometer showed the ravine bottom was 19 degrees warmer than the exposed ridge above, measured at the same time of day. Cyrus stood in that ravine for an hour, thinking. Every piece of conventional frontier wisdom said to build high and exposed. Clear sight lines, good drainage, visibility against threats, but those priorities assumed defense against human or animal attack was the primary concern. Lazarus hadn't died from an attack. He had died from cold. The cabin's exposed position had killed him. What if conventional wisdom was wrong? What if survival required different priorities? The ravine became Cyrus's laboratory. He returned every few days throughout late February and into March, always bringing his thermometer, always taking measurements. He mapped the ravine's geography in his mind. It ran roughly north to south, carved into the mountainside by thousands of years of water flow. The walls rose 30 feet at the deepest point, solid granite worn smooth by ancient floods. At the southern end, the ravine opened onto a meadow. At the northern end, it narrowed to a crack barely wide enough for a man to walk through. Water flowed only during spring melt. The rest of the year, the ravine bottom remained dry except for one small seep spring that provided year-round water. One afternoon, exploring the eastern wall, Cyrus found something unexpected. A depression in the rock face, artificial, clearly carved by tools, then another, and another. Stone rings where fires had been built, charcoal stains on the granite. Someone had lived here, and recently enough that evidence remained. He studied the site carefully. The fire pits were built directly against the rock wall in a spot where an overhang provided additional shelter. The stone around the pits showed heat staining, indicating long-term use. He found post holes drilled into solid rock, suggesting some kind of structure had been erected here. The placement was deliberate and sophisticated. Whoever built this camp understood exactly what they were doing. Cyrus realized he was looking at a native winter camp. The Crow and Blackfeet both traveled through this region. They would know from generations of experience where to shelter during harsh weather, and they had chosen this ravine, this specific spot, protected by rock walls and positioned for maximum thermal advantage. He spent the afternoon examining every detail. The camp was positioned where the ravine walls converged slightly, creating a natural alcove. The overhang above protected from snow and rain. The solid stone behind would absorb heat from fires and radiate it back through the night. The configuration created a natural reflector oven, concentrating warmth where people would sleep. The indigenous builders had understood principles that white trappers ignored. They prioritized wind protection over visibility. They used thermal mass instead of fighting against cold with endless fuel. They worked with the landscape rather than imposing structures upon it. Cyrus took measurements. At the native camp location, afternoon sun hit the rock wall directly, warming the stone. That warmth persisted hours after sunset. The overhang above trapped warm air like a lid on a pot. Even without fire, the spot was noticeably warmer than surrounding areas. He measured the ravine's width at various points. At the camp location, the walls were 42 feet apart. Narrow enough to block wind completely, wide enough to avoid feeling confined. The proportions were ideal. Nature had carved the perfect shelter. The native builders had simply recognized it and added fire. That night, back in his failing cabin on the exposed ridge, Cyrus made a decision. He would build in the ravine. Not a simple camp like the native site, but a permanent structure that combined their wisdom with frontier construction techniques. People would think he was insane. He didn't care. Lazarus had died following conventional wisdom. Cyrus would try something different. Spring arrived in early April. The snow melted. Creeks swelled with runoff, and trappers began emerging from their winter isolation. Cyrus loaded his season's pelts onto his packhorse and headed to the nearest trading post, a rough collection of cabins 30 miles south, where trappers gathered to sell furs and resupply. Thaddeus Wycliffe was there, a veteran mountain man who had survived 15 winters in the Rockies. He and Cyrus had trapped the same region for 3 years, maintaining the respectful distance common among men who valued solitude. Wycliffe noticed Cyrus had come alone. "Where's Gorman?" he asked, already knowing the answer from Cyrus's expression. "Froze," Cyrus said. "January. Made it back to the cabin but couldn't get warm. Died overnight despite fire burning constant." Wycliffe nodded slowly. He had seen men die that way before. "Hard country. Claims good men regular." "It shouldn't have," Cyrus said. "The cabin failed him. Built wrong. I'm fixing that problem." "How you mean?" Cyrus explained his observations about earth temperature, wind protection, and thermal mass. He described the ravine, the native camp, his measurements and calculations. He told Wycliffe his plan to build there, creating a semi-underground structure that would maintain stable temperature regardless of surface weather. Wycliffe stared at him like he had announced plans to fly to the moon. "You're talking about building in a ravine," Wycliffe said slowly. "Below grade, surrounded by rock walls." "That's right. That's the dumbest thing I've heard in 20 years of mountain trapping." Wycliffe listed the problems. Spring floods would drown him when snowmelt funneled through the ravine. Avalanches would bury the structure under tons of snow and rock. He would have no sight lines, no way to see threats approaching. Cold air settles in low places. Ravines are colder than ridges, everyone knows that. The rock walls would trap moisture, creating perpetual dampness that would rot everything and breed sickness. "Every point you make assumes I'm stupid," Cyrus said calmly. "I've measured that ravine in every weather condition for 2 months. I know where water flows and where it doesn't. I know where avalanche danger exists and where bedrock is solid. I know cold air settlement happens in still conditions, but wind protection matters more in extreme weather, and I know Lazarus died in a cabin built exactly where you would build one." Wycliffe shook his head. "Grief's twisted your thinking, Haldane. You build in that ravine, you're building your own tomb." Word spread through the trading post. By evening, every trapper there had heard about Cyrus's plan. The reactions ranged from concern to mockery. Gideon Sloan, a young trapper known for running his mouth, started calling it Haldane's grave. Others picked up the name. They made jokes about whether he would die from drowning, avalanche, or simply going mad from isolation in a hole in the ground. Enoch Brewster, who led a small settlement of trappers and their families 15 miles north of Cyrus's territory, pulled him aside. "You're welcome to winter with us if this ravine business doesn't work. No shame in trying something and changing course when reality sets in. "Appreciate it," Cyrus said. "Won't need it." He sold his furs, bought supplies, and headed back into the mountains. Behind him, trappers shook their heads and made bets on how long he would last. Cyrus returned to the ravine in mid-April with 3 months of construction season ahead of him. Most trappers could build a serviceable cabin in 4 or 5 days. Cyrus planned to spend the entire summer building something unprecedented. But first, he needed to choose the exact location with scientific precision. He started by mapping water flow during spring melt. The ravine carried significant runoff in early April as snow melted on the surrounding slopes. He marked the high water line with stakes, noting where water ran fast and where it pooled. He identified the channels carved by centuries of flow and the elevated areas that remained dry even during peak runoff. By late April, the flood had diminished to a modest creek running down the ravine center. Cyrus could see clearly which areas were safe from water. The eastern side, where the native camp had been located, featured a natural bench 8 feet above the current water level and 12 feet above the ravine bottom. Even during peak melt, water had not reached this elevation. He studied snow accumulation patterns by examining vegetation and rock wear. Areas that received heavy snow loads showed bent branches and smoothed stone. Areas protected by overhangs or wall configurations showed different patterns. He identified 2 locations where the ravine's geometry created natural snow deflection, causing precipitation to blow over rather than accumulate inside. He examined the rock walls themselves, looking for stability. Some sections showed fracture lines or loose material that might eventually collapse. Other sections were solid granite, weathered for thousands of years into stable formations. He tested rocks by climbing and applying weight, checking for movement. He mapped every crack and seam. Wind patterns required careful observation. He hung strips of cloth at various heights and locations, watching how air moved through the ravine under different conditions. During storms, wind howled over the top but barely penetrated below the rim. During calm weather, gentle circulation moved up the ravine as sun warmed the rock walls. He identified dead zones where air barely moved, and active zones where circulation was consistent. Temperature measurements continued throughout April and into May. He took readings at dawn, noon, and dusk at multiple locations and elevations. The data confirmed his initial observations. The ravine bottom maintained temperatures 10 to 20 degrees warmer than exposed ridges during cold weather. The eastern wall received direct sun for 6 hours each afternoon, warming the rock substantially. By mid-May, Cyrus had identified the optimal location. It was on the eastern bench, 30 feet from the current water channel, positioned where the ravine walls converged slightly to create maximum wind protection. An overhang 12 feet above provided shelter from precipitation, while still allowing smoke to escape. The rock wall behind was solid granite with no fracture lines. The spot was elevated enough to avoid any conceivable flood. The wall configuration deflected snow accumulation. Sun exposure was ideal for warming thermal mass. The bench was large enough for his planned structure, with room for access and future expansion if needed. Every measurement, every observation pointed to this exact location. Cyrus drove stakes marking the structure's footprint. Then he began the work that would consume his summer and change frontier construction forever. Cyrus started construction with an element that violated every principle of frontier cabin building. He began digging. Most trappers built on top of the ground, stacking logs on a foundation of rocks or simply setting them on leveled earth. Cyrus was excavating downward, creating a cavity that would become the heart of his thermal system. He marked out a rectangle 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. Then he started removing earth and rock. The work was brutal and slow. He had a shovel, a pickaxe, and a pry bar. Every bucket of material had to be carried out and dumped away from the construction site. The ravine's isolation meant he worked entirely alone. The first 2 feet came out relatively easily, Soil and small rocks could be loosened and shoveled. Below that, he hit larger stones embedded in harder, packed earth. These required the pickaxe to break free, then the pry bar to lever them out of position. Some stones weighed 50 or 60 pounds. He developed a technique of rocking them back and forth, working them gradually upward until they could be rolled out of the excavation. He went down 4 feet, creating a chamber that would be partially underground when finished. The walls of the excavation required constant attention. Loose material wanted to slumble back in. He shored up the sides with timber frames as he dug deeper, preventing collapse. At 4 feet depth, he began excavating backward into the slope. This was the most challenging part. He was creating a chamber that extended 8 feet into the hillside, surrounded by earth on 3 sides. The overhead material had to be supported carefully to prevent cave-ins. He built a temporary ceiling of heavy timbers propped on posts, allowing him to work beneath, while the earth above remained stable. Gideon Sloan passed by one afternoon and watched Cyrus working in the pit. "Digging your grave yourself," he called down. "At least you'll save someone else the trouble." Cyrus ignored him and kept digging. He excavated the full depth, creating a chamber that was 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 4 feet below grade. The back wall, sides, and floor were all earth, carved out and smoothed. Only the front remained open to the ravine. He built a drainage channel at the base of the excavation, angling it slightly toward the ravine opening. Any water that might seep in would drain away rather than pooling. He lined this channel with rocks, creating a permanent path for moisture to escape. The excavation took 3 weeks of constant labor. When finished, Cyrus had created a cave by human effort. It looked like madness to anyone passing by, a man digging a hole in the ground, far from any gold or mineral prospect. But Cyrus saw it differently. He saw the foundation of a structure that would maintain stable temperature regardless of what happened on the surface. The earth surrounding this chamber would become his furnace and his fortress. Now he needed to build the walls that would contain and direct that precious heat. With the excavation complete, Cyrus began the work that would define the quality of his entire structure. He needed stones, not just any rocks grabbed randomly from the ravine, but specific stones selected for size, shape, and characteristics. He was building walls that would need to fit together precisely, creating both strength and thermal mass. He established criteria. Each stone had to have at least one flat face that would form the exterior surface of the wall. The stone had to be solid granite or similar hard material, not sedimentary rock that might fracture or crumble. Size mattered. Stones between 20 and 40 pounds were ideal, large enough to create substantial mass, small enough for one man to handle and position accurately. He spent a week gathering stones. The ravine provided abundant material. Thousands of years of freeze-thaw cycles had fractured rocks from the walls, tumbling them to the ravine floor where spring floods had moved and sorted them. Cyrus walked the ravine length, examining rocks, testing them, selecting only those meeting his standards. He hauled stones to his construction site using a makeshift sled built from poles. Each trip brought 4 or 5 stones. He sorted them by size and shape, creating piles organized by how they might be used. Cornerstones with 2 flat faces. Wall stones with 1 good face. Fill stones smaller and irregular for interior portions of the thick walls. Before laying the first stone, Cyrus studied techniques. He remembered stone walls from his childhood in Vermont, boundaries between farms built by farmers clearing fields. Those walls had stood for generations. He thought about the principles. Stones had to overlap like bricks, never creating vertical seams that ran through multiple layers. Weight had to distribute across multiple stones below. Gaps had to be minimized. He began laying the first course of stones around the perimeter of his excavation. These foundation stones were the largest and flattest he had found. He set them carefully, using smaller rocks as shims to ensure each stone sat level and stable. The first course formed a rectangle following his excavation boundaries. The second course required more skill. Each stone had to bridge the gap between two stones below it, creating an overlapping pattern. He discovered that finding the right stone for each position was like solving a puzzle. Shape mattered as much as size. A stone with a slight curve might fit perfectly where a rectangular stone wouldn't. He learned to see how stones would interact before lifting them into place. Gaps between stones were inevitable, but had to be minimized. Cyrus used a hammer and chisel to shape contact surfaces, creating better fits. The work was painstaking. A single stone might require an hour of fitting, testing, removing, adjusting, and refitting before it seated properly. He mixed clay with water to create mortar for filling remaining gaps. The clay came from a deposit he found upstream, dug out, and carried back in buckets. The mortar wasn't structural, the stones themselves provided strength, but it sealed air gaps and created a more continuous thermal mass. The walls rose slowly. 3 inches per day was good progress. Each course required selecting stones, testing fits, shaping as needed, and mortaring. Cyrus worked with obsessive attention to detail, understanding that these walls would determine whether his structure succeeded or failed. By late June, the stone chamber walls had reached 3 feet in height, rising from the excavation floor. Cyrus was building them thick, 18 inches of solid stone, much thicker than necessary for simple structural support. The thickness served a different purpose. He was creating thermal mass, material that would absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, moderating temperature extremes. The chamber was taking shape as a partially underground room. The back wall and 2 side walls were surrounded by earth, pressed against the excavation boundaries he had carved. Only the front wall, facing the ravine, stood free. This configuration meant 3 walls maintained constant contact with earth below the frost line, where temperature remained stable year-round. Cyrus understood the physics without being able to articulate it mathematically. Earth 4 feet below the surface maintains a temperature roughly equal to the annual average air temperature of the region. For this Montana location, that meant approximately 45 to 50 degrees. The earth surrounding his chamber would constantly transfer heat to or from the stone walls, pulling them toward that equilibrium temperature. In winter, when surface air might drop to 40 below zero, the chamber walls touching earth would remain near 50 degrees. In summer, when surface air might reach 90 degrees, those same walls would stay cool. The massive stone construction would resist rapid temperature change, creating stability regardless of surface weather chaos. He built the walls up to 6 feet in height, creating a chamber tall enough for a man to stand inside comfortably. The work consumed thousands of individual stones. Each stone was placed, fitted, adjusted, mortared. The process was meditative in its repetition, but demanded constant attention. A poorly fitted stone created a weak point. A gap left unsealed allowed air infiltration that would reduce thermal efficiency. At 4 feet above the excavation floor, he created 2 openings in the front wall. These weren't windows in the traditional sense. They were ventilation ports, rectangular openings 16 inches wide and 12 inches tall. They would allow air circulation between the chamber and the upper cabin he planned to build above. Warm air could rise through these ports. Fresh air could enter when needed. He built the ports with carefully selected flat stones forming the top and sides, creating stable openings that wouldn't collapse. He left them unobstructed, understanding that controlling airflow would be critical to making his thermal system work properly. The floor of the chamber received equal attention. He laid flat stones across the entire floor area, creating a solid surface with good earth contact below. Each floor stone touched earth directly. Heat would transfer through these stones, warming them from below. The stone floor would become a radiator, sending warmth upward into the chamber and eventually into the cabin above. By mid-July, the chamber was essentially complete. 4 walls of 18-inch thick stone 2 ventilation ports, and a stone floor, all surrounded by earth on 3 sides and below. Cyrus climbed inside and felt the temperature difference immediately. Outside the chamber, July afternoon sun made the ravine uncomfortably warm. Inside the chamber, the temperature was cool and stable. His thermometer read 51 degrees. The thermal battery was functional. With the stone chamber complete, Cyrus began the construction phase that would elevate his cabin above the thermal battery he had built. This required a timber framework strong enough to support not just the cabin's weight, but also snow loads, supplies, and the constant stress of thermal expansion and contraction. The engineering had to be precise. He selected trees for the support posts with extreme care. He wanted straight pines approximately 14 inches in diameter at the base, tall enough to provide 8-foot posts after trimming. These posts would bear the entire weight of the upper structure. Weakness in any post would compromise the entire system. He found suitable trees a half-mile from the construction site and spent a week felling, trimming, and hauling them. He cut 12 posts total, knowing he needed 8 for the primary framework, but wanting spares in case of errors or defects discovered during construction. Each post weighed approximately 200 pounds. Moving them required a sled and patient effort. He shaped the base of each post flat, creating a stable contact surface. Then he set the posts in a rectangular pattern around and partially over the stone chamber. 4 posts sat on bedrock outside the chamber's front wall. 4 more posts sat on the chamber's side walls, distributing weight across the thick stone construction. The spacing was calculated carefully. Posts were positioned to support crossbeams that would span the distances without sagging. He measured and remeasured, ensuring the pattern would create a stable platform. Each post had to be perfectly vertical. He used a plumb line, checking alignment from multiple angles. Setting the posts required digging holes 18 inches deep into earth and bedrock. He made the holes slightly oversized, set the posts, checked vertical alignment, then packed the holes tight with rocks and tamped earth. The posts had to be immobile. Any shifting would create structural failure. With posts set and cured for a week, Cyrus began installing crossbeams. These were logs 10 to 12 inches in diameter, spanning between posts. He notched the tops of posts to receive the crossbeams, creating mortise joints that locked everything together. Each beam required lifting, positioning, testing fit, removing, adjusting notches, and reinstalling. The work was exhausting for one man. He used wooden pegs driven through drilled holes to secure each joint. The pegs were made from seasoned oak, harder than the pine posts and beams. They created connections that couldn't separate under load. Each joint received 2 pegs driven at angles, locking the connection from multiple directions. The crossbeam network created a grid spanning the area above the stone chamber and extending forward over the ravine floor. This grid would support the cabin floor. Crucially, it left an air gap between the chamber's stone roof and the cabin floor above. That gap would allow warm air from the chamber to rise and circulate, heating the cabin floor from below. By early August, the platform framework stood complete. 8 massive posts supporting a network of crossbeams, all locked together with mortise joints and oak pegs. Cyrus tested it by loading stones onto the framework, gradually increasing weight. The structure didn't flex or shift. It was ready to support a cabin. Cyrus began building the floor system that would sit atop his platform framework. This wasn't simply a matter of laying planks across beams. He was creating the interface between his underground thermal battery and the living space above. The floor had to allow heat transfer while providing structural support and creating a livable surface. He split logs into planks using wedges and a maul. Each log was carefully selected for straight grain that would split cleanly. He drove wedges into the end grain, gradually working down the length until the log separated into halves. Then he split the halves into quarters, creating planks roughly 4 inches thick and 10 to 12 inches wide. The splitting process produced rough surfaces. He smoothed one side of each plank using a draw knife, shaving away irregularities until the surface was relatively flat. The work was tedious and required replacing the blade edge frequently. He went through 3 sharpening stones that summer, wearing them down to maintain his cutting tools. He laid the planks across the crossbeams with small gaps between each plank. These gaps weren't defects. They were intentional ventilation channels. Warm air rising from the stone chamber below would pass through these gaps, entering the cabin living space. The gaps were narrow, only half an inch, but sufficient for airflow without creating drafts or losing small items. He pegged each plank to the crossbeams below using wooden pins. Every joint was secured. The floor became a rigid surface, but one that allowed thermal communication between the chamber and cabin. He could feel the principle working even before the cabin walls went up. Standing on the completed floor, he felt warmth rising from below. The stone chamber maintained its stable 50 degrees, and that warmth was transferring upward. He built additional features into the floor system. Near where he planned to position his sleeping area, he created a section with wider gaps and a removable panel. This would allow him to open direct access to the chamber's warm air during the coldest weather. He could control how much heat entered the cabin by opening or closing this access. He also built in small hatches that could be opened to the chamber below for storage. The chamber's stable, cool temperature made it ideal for food preservation. Meat would keep longer in 50-degree conditions than in a cabin that might reach 70 degrees during summer. The hatches gave him access to this natural refrigeration. The floor system took 2 weeks to complete. When finished, Cyrus had a solid platform 8 feet above the ravine floor, positioned directly over his stone chamber with controlled ventilation, allowing thermal transfer. The structure was evolving from concept to reality. The underground battery was built. The platform connecting it to the living space was complete. Now he needed to build the cabin itself, positioned between the ravine's protective walls where wind could never reach it, and where warmth from below would rise constantly through cold months ahead. The cabin that rose on Cyrus's platform followed traditional horizontal log construction in most respects. He wasn't trying to reinvent cabin building itself. His innovation was placement and integration with the thermal system below. The cabin would be conventional in form, but revolutionary in function because of where and how it sat. He selected logs for the walls, using the same careful criteria he had applied throughout construction. Each log had to be relatively straight, approximately 12 inches in diameter, and free of major defects. He stripped bark completely using his draw knife, creating smooth surfaces that would fit together with minimal gaps. The cabin dimensions were determined by the platform framework below, 12 feet wide and 16 feet long. Small by some standards, but Cyrus was one man who valued efficiency over space. A smaller cabin required less heating, less material, and less time to build. Every dimension served function. He laid the first course of logs directly on the platform floor, pegging them to the planks below. These foundation logs were notched at corners using a saddle joint technique that locked them together while allowing each log to bear weight on the logs beneath. The notching required precision. Each cut had to match its mate perfectly, or gaps would form. The walls rose course by course. Cyrus worked alone, using a ramp and rope system to lift logs into position. Each log was rolled up the ramp, positioned, tested for fit, then secured. He chinked between logs using a mixture he had developed: clay mixed with horsehair from his pack animals and pine resin he had collected and boiled down. The mixture was flexible when applied, but hardened to create a seal that was both waterproof and durable. The horsehair reinforced the clay, preventing cracking as it dried. The pine resin provided adhesive properties and waterproofing. The combination was superior to simple mud chinking that would crack and fall out within a season. Cyrus's chinking would last years. The walls reached 6 feet in height by late August. He built in two small windows, one on the front wall facing the ravine opening and one on the side wall. The windows were small deliberately, only 12 inches square. Smaller windows lost less heat and were easier to secure and shutter. The cabin sat nestled between the ravine walls that rose another 10 feet on each side. The proportions created a sheltered feeling. The massive rock walls blocked wind completely. Standing inside the rising cabin structure, Cyrus felt no air movement even when wind howled across the ridges above. He was building inside a protected microclimate. The ravine walls were doing half the work of shelter. His cabin only needed to complete the enclosure. Together, rock walls and log cabin would create a space where temperature could be controlled, where warmth from the earth below would be retained rather than lost to wind, where survival became engineering rather than suffering. The chimney represented Cyrus's final major construction element, and he approached it with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized every other aspect of the build. Most frontier cabins used simple mud and stick chimneys that lasted a season or two before requiring rebuilding. Cyrus was building something permanent that would also serve as additional thermal mass. He gathered stones specifically for chimney construction. He needed flat pieces that would stack in a narrowing pattern, creating a flue that would draw smoke efficiently while retaining and radiating heat. The stones came from the same ravine that provided everything else. He spent 3 days selecting and hauling the right pieces. The chimney base sat in the corner of the cabin, built on the platform floor with additional support beams beneath to handle the weight. He started with large foundation stones, creating a solid base 2 feet square. Then he began stacking, using his clay mortar between each stone, building upward in a gradually narrowing pattern. The interior of the chimney formed a flue 18 inches square at the base, narrowing to 12 inches at the top. This taper created natural draft. Warm air and smoke would rise, pulled upward by the pressure differential. The draw would be strong enough to keep smoke flowing out rather than backing into the cabin. He built a smoke shelf 3 feet up from the base. This was a horizontal ledge that projected into the flue, creating a baffle. The shelf would catch down drafts and redirect them upward while reflecting heat back into the cabin. It was a technique he had seen in well-built fireplaces in New England, and he adapted it to his stone construction. The chimney rose through the roof, extending 4 feet above the peak. This height ensured smoke would clear the roof and that wind passing over the ravine wouldn't create backdrafts. He capped it with flat stones that created a rain cover while leaving openings for smoke to exit from 4 sides. The massive stone construction served multiple purposes. It provided a safe fireplace that wouldn't burn down the cabin. The stones absorbed heat from fires and continued radiating warmth hours after flames died. The thermal mass stabilized temperature, preventing the extreme swings common in cabins with minimal heat retention. Inside the cabin, Cyrus built a stone shelf along one wall. This shelf sat 18 inches above the floor, positioned directly over one of the ventilation gaps. Warm air rising from the chamber below would flow around and through this shelf. Items placed on it would be gently warmed. The shelf became a drying rack, a warming station, and additional thermal mass all functioning together. He created stone surfaces throughout the cabin interior wherever possible, a stone counter for food preparation, stone borders around the windows that would absorb sunlight during the day. Every stone surface added thermal mass, creating a system where heat was captured, stored, and released slowly. The cabin was becoming not just shelter, but a thermal regulation machine, engineered to maintain stable temperature through the principles Cyrus had observed and tested throughout the summer. September arrived with cooling nights that signaled winter's inevitable approach. Cyrus worked with increased urgency to complete the remaining construction elements. The cabin structure was complete, but details remained that would determine whether his system functioned as designed or failed as spectacularly as everyone predicted. The roof construction followed principles similar to the rest of the build. He laid ridge poles across the cabin's width, spacing them closely to support the weight of multiple roof layers. Over these poles he placed split planks, creating a solid deck. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering gaps in the layer below. Over the planks he laid birch bark in multiple overlapping sheets. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible. He had gathered it earlier in summer when it peeled easily from trees. The bark created a moisture barrier that would shed rain and snowmelt. Over the bark he spread a layer of his clay mixture, sealing every potential leak point. The final roof layer was sod. Living earth with grass and roots intact, cut in sections, and laid grass side up. The sod would root together, creating a living roof that provided insulation, absorbed precipitation, and added thermal mass. The multiple layers made the roof extraordinarily heavy, but his robust wall and platform construction supported the weight easily. He built a door from thick planks, fitting them tightly and reinforcing with cross-bracing. The door hung on iron hinges he had bought at the trading post months earlier. A wooden bar on the interior provided security. The door was heavy and solid, sealing tightly when closed. The windows received shutters, built from the same thick planks as the door. The shutters could be secured from inside, completely blocking wind and retaining heat during harsh weather. When open, they allowed light and fresh air. Behind each shutter, he installed oiled canvas that provided a translucent weatherproof layer even with shutters open. He built a sleeping platform along one wall, elevated 2 feet off the floor. The elevation kept him off the coldest air layer while positioning him in the warmer air rising from the floor gaps. Under the platform, he created storage space for supplies. He constructed shelves, a table, and basic furnishings. Everything was built solid and permanent. This wasn't a temporary camp. It was a home designed to last decades. Every element reflected the same obsessive attention to quality that had characterized the entire project. In early October, Cyrus moved his supplies into the completed cabin. Traps, tools, food stores, ammunition, everything a mountain man needed for winter isolation. He organized the stone chamber below for cold storage, loading it with meat he had hunted and smoked. The stable temperature would preserve food far better than the fluctuating conditions in a standard cabin. He tested the thermal system on cold October nights. When outside temperature dropped to 20 degrees, the stone chamber maintained 51 degrees. Warmth rose through the floor gaps. With minimal fire in the chimney, cabin temperature stayed at 58 degrees. The system worked exactly as he had calculated. 3 months of obsessive construction had created something unprecedented. November brought the first serious snow. Flakes fell steadily for 2 days, accumulating 8 inches on exposed ground. In the ravine, snow patterns followed the wind deflection Cyrus had mapped months earlier. The ravine walls caused most snow to blow over and past, with only light accumulation on the ravine floor and virtually none on the sheltered cabin roof. Trappers began their winter routines, checking lines in increasingly difficult conditions, burning through wood supplies, and preparing for months of isolation. Several stopped by Cyrus's ravine location, curious about the structure that had consumed his entire summer. Thaddeus Wycliffe arrived in mid-November. He stood at the ravine entrance, staring at the cabin nestled between rock walls, elevated on its platform above the stone chamber. His expression showed confusion and concern. "You actually built it," Wycliffe said. "Haldane's tomb is real." Cyrus invited him inside. Wycliffe climbed the steps to the cabin entrance and stopped immediately upon entering. The interior was warm, not just tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. A small fire burned in the stone fireplace, but it was modest, consuming perhaps 3 logs. The cabin felt warmer than Wycliffe's own cabin, with a fire 3 times that size. "How is it this warm?" Wycliffe asked. Cyrus explained. He showed Wycliffe the floor gaps where warm air rose from the stone chamber below. He took him down to see the chamber itself, demonstrating the stable 50-degree temperature maintained by Earth contact. He explained thermal mass, wind protection, and the integrated system he had created. Wycliffe listened but remained skeptical. "It's not even winter yet. Wait until January when it drops to 30 below for a week straight. That's when you'll see if this works or if you freeze like Gorman did." "I'll be here," Cyrus said. Enoch Brewster visited a week later with a similar message. His settlement 15 miles north had cabins, neighbors, community support if weather turned brutal. "Offer stands," Brewster said. "When reality hits, come north. No shame in it." Gideon Sloan made a point of stopping by in early December. He examined the construction with obvious disappointment. "Thought you'd be dead or gone by now," he said. "Winter's just starting, though. Plenty of time for this fool project to kill you." The comments bothered Cyrus less than the underlying assumptions. Everyone expected failure. They couldn't imagine that someone had actually solved the problem of winter shelter through engineering rather than endurance. They saw his work and still believed conventional wisdom was correct. But Cyrus had data. He kept careful records. Outside temperature, chamber temperature, cabin temperature, with various fire levels. The numbers told the story. On December 10th, with outside temperature at 8 degrees and no fire burning, the cabin maintained 45 degrees from chamber heat alone. With a small fire, cabin temperature rose to 60 degrees. He was using 1/5 the wood of a standard cabin and maintaining better interior conditions. The system wasn't just working, it was exceeding his projections. Winter was coming and Cyrus was ready. The blizzard arrived on January 17, 1840. The temperature dropped throughout the morning, falling from 10 degrees at dawn to 0 by noon. Then it continued dropping. By evening, Cyrus's thermometer registered 20 below zero. By midnight, 30 below. Wind howled across the mountains with a ferocity that made exposed travel impossible. The blizzard wasn't just cold, it was sustained. Most winter storms passed through in a day or two. This system stalled over the region, grinding forward with brutal consistency. The second day was colder than the first. By afternoon, Cyrus's exterior thermometer showed 43 degrees below zero. Wind made the effective temperature even lower. 15 miles north, Enoch Brewster's settlement battened down. Families crowded into the largest cabins, combining body heat and resources. Fires burned constantly in every structure. Men took shifts feeding flames, knowing that letting fires die meant death. Despite these efforts, interior temperatures hovered near freezing. Children wore every piece of clothing they owned. Adults, wrapped in blankets and furs, still shivered. Thaddeus Wycliffe's cabin, built on an exposed ridge following conventional wisdom, became a battleground against cold. He burned logs as fast as he could split them. His fire consumed wood at an unsustainable rate. The wind found every crack and gap in his chinking, driving cold air through the walls. He stuffed rags into gaps, piled furs against the walls, did everything possible to retain heat. His interior thermometer read 7 degrees despite the massive fire. Barnabas. Kettering, trapping a territory 20 miles west of Cyrus, faced similar conditions. His cabin was well built by standard criteria: good logs, tight corners, solid construction. But it couldn't withstand this cold. His fire roared in the hearth, consuming his carefully gathered wood supply at an alarming rate. He calculated he had 4 days of fuel remaining if the cold continued. After that, he would have to choose between freezing or abandoning his trap lines to cut more wood in impossibly dangerous conditions. On the second night, Kettering watched his interior temperature drop despite feeding the fire constantly. 9 degrees, then 7, then 5. The thermometer hung on the wall 3 feet from the fireplace where flames threw heat continuously. If the temperature 3 feet from the fire was 5 degrees, the corners of the cabin were well below zero. He made a decision. He couldn't survive here. He packed essential supplies, dressed in every layer he owned, and prepared to travel. The nearest shelter was Cyrus Haldane's Ravine cabin, approximately 8 miles south. Kettering knew the route. He would travel at first light, hoping to cover the distance before cold or exhaustion killed him. Other trappers thought Haldane's ravine structure was a death trap. But Kettering was dying in a conventional cabin. Any alternative was worth attempting. Inside the ravine cabin, conditions were remarkably different. Cyrus woke on the second morning of the blizzard and checked his thermometers. Exterior temperature remained at 43 below zero. The stone chamber below maintained 51 degrees, completely unaffected by surface weather. The cabin interior, with only minimal fire burning through the night, held at 16 degrees. Cyrus added 3 logs to the fire and made coffee. Within an hour, cabin temperature rose to 18 degrees. He was comfortable in wool shirt and vest, no heavy coat required indoors. The floor beneath his feet radiated gentle warmth from the rising chamber air. The massive stone chimney retained heat from the fire, continuing to warm the space hours after flames diminished. He looked out the small window. Snow blew horizontally across the ravine entrance, but inside the ravine itself, air barely moved. The rock walls blocked wind completely. Snow accumulated in the ravine, but the wind patterns Cyrus had mapped months earlier proved accurate. Most precipitation blew over the top. What did fall into the ravine settled in specific areas he had anticipated, leaving his cabin entrance and the area around his structure relatively clear. The system was performing exactly as engineered. The chamber's earth contact provided a constant heat source. The rising, warm air heated the cabin floor from below. The wind protection eliminated the convective heat loss that was killing trappers in exposed locations. The thermal mass of stone walls, chimney, and shelves absorbed and released heat slowly, preventing temperature swings. Cyrus recorded his measurements in a journal he kept for this purpose. Chamber temperature, cabin temperature, exterior temperature, fuel consumption, time. The data was irrefutable. He was maintaining interior conditions 40 degrees warmer than trappers in conventional cabins, using a fraction of the wood they were burning through desperately. He went about his day with normal routine. He prepared food using the stone shelf warmed by rising chamber air. He worked on trap repairs and equipment maintenance. He read from one of the 3 books he owned. The cabin was a comfortable workspace, not a survival situation requiring constant attention to staying alive. By afternoon, he added 2 more logs to the fire. Cabin temperature rose to 20 degrees. He was living comfortably in conditions that were killing men in structures built according to accepted frontier wisdom. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every trapper who had mocked his ravine construction was currently fighting for survival while he worked in shirt sleeves. As evening approached, Cyrus heard shouting from the ravine entrance. He grabbed his rifle and looked out. A figure stumbled through the snow, moving with the uncoordinated desperation of someone near collapse. Cyrus recognized the build and gait. Barnabas Kettering, barely conscious, had somehow made it 8 miles through the blizzard. Cyrus opened the cabin door and shouted directions, guiding Kettering toward the stairs. The man who arrived at the ravine cabin was severely frostbitten and near death, but he had made it. He had found the structure everyone called Haldane's tomb, and he was about to discover it was actually salvation. Barnabas Kettering collapsed at the base of the stairs leading to Cyrus's cabin. Cyrus descended quickly and helped the man to his feet. Kettering's face was white with frostbite. His hands were rigid inside frozen mittens. He was shaking violently, his body's last attempt to generate heat before shutting down completely. Cyrus didn't take him directly to the warm cabin. That would be dangerous. Rapid warming of severely frostbitten tissue caused additional damage. Instead, he guided Kettering down to the stone chamber. The chamber's stable 51-degree temperature was perfect for gradual rewarming. Cyrus sat Kettering on the stone floor, which radiated gentle warmth from earth contact below. He removed the man's frozen outer layers carefully, checking for ice damage to clothing and skin. Kettering's fingers and toes were white, possibly beyond saving, but the core warming needed to happen slowly. He wrapped Kettering in blankets and let the chamber's ambient temperature do the work. After 30 minutes, color began returning to Kettering's face. After an hour, he stopped shaking. After 2 hours, he could speak. "How is it warm here?" Kettering whispered. "Earth contact," Cyrus said. "This chamber is surrounded by ground that never freezes. Temperature stays constant, year-round. We're sitting in 50-degree air while it's 43 below outside." Kettering looked around the stone chamber with wonder. "Everyone said you were building a tomb." Everyone was wrong. After 3 hours in the chamber, Kettering's core temperature had stabilized enough to move upstairs. Cyrus helped him climb to the cabin level. Kettering stopped at the doorway, staring at the thermometer mounted on the interior wall. 18 degrees. The cabin was 18 degrees with only a moderate fire burning. "My cabin was 5 degrees, Kettering said. 3 feet from a fire consuming logs every 20 minutes. 5 degrees. Cyrus showed him the system, the floor gaps allowing chamber heat to rise, the wind protection from ravine walls, the thermal mass of stone surfaces, the integrated design that worked with natural principles rather than fighting against them. Kettering listened with the intensity of a man who had nearly died and wanted to understand why he was alive. Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard continued, Kettering recovered. His fingers and toes were damaged but not lost. He would heal. More importantly, he was learning. Cyrus shared everything: measurements, construction techniques, the reasoning behind every design choice. Kettering took notes when his hands recovered enough to hold a pencil. On the 4th day, the blizzard broke. Temperature rose to 0, then 10 above. The immediate crisis passed. Kettering prepared to return to his cabin, knowing he would need to salvage what he could and plan for a different future. Before leaving, he shook Cyrus's hand. "I'm telling everyone what you did here," Kettering said. "No more Haldane's tomb jokes. This is Haldane's fortress. This is survival." Cyrus nodded. He didn't need recognition, but he wouldn't refuse it. If sharing what he had learned saved other lives, that was worth the mockery he had endured. Barnabas Kettering kept his word. He traveled to Enoch Brewster's settlement and described what he had experienced. The numbers were undeniable. 43 degrees below zero outside. 18 degrees inside the Ravine cabin with minimal fire. 51 degrees in the stone chamber without any fire at all. Men who had burned through weeks of wood supply in days listened with new understanding. Brewster organized a group to visit Cyrus's Ravine cabin in late February. 6 trappers made the journey, examining the construction with careful attention. They descended into the stone chamber and felt the stable warmth. They studied the platform framework, allowing air circulation. They observed how the ravine walls blocked wind completely. What had seemed like madness 8 months earlier now appeared as sophisticated engineering. Thaddeus Wycliffe was among the visitors. He stood in the cabin looking at the thermometer, feeling warmth rising through the floor gaps. "I was wrong," he said simply. "You solved something the rest of us just accepted as unsolvable." Cyrus shared his techniques without reservation. He explained Earth contact principles, thermal mass concepts, wind protection strategies. He showed them his notes and measurements. He answered every question. The knowledge belonged to anyone who could use it to survive. By spring of 1840, 3 trappers had begun building ravine structures using variations of Cyrus's design. They selected locations carefully, applying the principles he had demonstrated. Not every ravine was suitable, but those meeting specific criteria provided the same advantages Cyrus had discovered. Earth contact for stable temperature, rock walls for wind protection, elevated living space allowing warm air circulation. Over the next 5 years, the technique spread throughout the northern Rocky Mountain Territory. Trappers shared information at rendezvous gatherings. Miners heading to gold strikes adopted the principles for winter camps. Settlers moving west learned about earth-backed construction that could withstand extreme cold. By 1845, 12 structures using Cyrus's core concepts had been built across Montana and Wyoming territories. The exact designs varied. Some builders created full underground chambers like Cyrus's original. Others built partial earth-backed walls. Some used stone, others used log construction banked with earth. But all incorporated the essential principles: earth contact for thermal stability, wind protection through strategic placement, thermal mass for heat retention, integration with natural landscape features rather than fighting against them. Cyrus himself continued trapping until 1844. He saved enough money to leave the mountains and establish a small ranch in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory. He married in 1846, raised 4 children, and lived quietly. He never promoted his innovations or sought recognition. He died in 1855 at age 49. The newspaper obituary mentioned his early years as a mountain trapper, but said nothing about revolutionary cabin construction or engineering that changed frontier survival. In the mountains he left behind, several ravine cabins still stood. New occupants maintained them, recognizing their superior function. Some structures remained inhabited through the 1860s and beyond, sheltering multiple generations. The impossible had become routine. A cabin maintaining interior warmth while blizzards raged outside wasn't fantasy. It was physics properly understood and carefully applied. Cyrus Haldane proved that survival came not from toughness or weapons or luck, but from knowledge turning environment from enemy to ally through nothing more than careful construction and clear thinking about what actually mattered for staying alive.